So you're finally engaged and you're super excited and you're ready to launch into wedding planning and you know that you have to pick a venue first and you're like, let's do this, let's go. And then it dawns on you that you have no idea what you're looking for or how to ask questions or what the answers are that you should be looking for. And it starts to get really, really, really freaking overwhelming. Hello. Hi. If you're new here, my name is Jamie. I'm your online wedding planner and I'm here to help you crack the code on wedding planning because it's complicated, it's expensive, it's stressful, and it gives you all the feels in the wrong direction sometimes. And I am here to tell you that wedding planning does not have to be difficult. I promise you, I've helped hundreds of thousands of couples work through their wedding planning and get to the other side as stress-free and as budget-friendly as possible. And I'm happy to be here helping you guys in this week's video as well. We're going to be talking about 20 venue walkthrough questions that you should be asking as you are touring these locations. Newsflash, you're not supposed to know what you're looking for. You're not supposed to know the questions to ask. This is your first time doing this, and unless you're some sort of professional in the wedding industry in general, or maybe you have event planning experience, you probably are flying blind on this. And that's normal. Give yourself just a teensy bit of grace on this whole situation because it's a lot, and you're like learning a brand new language in a brand new industry. That's the intent and the heart of this video. I'm going to teach you the questions that you should be asking, and I also have it in a downloadable version if you are the pen to paper kind of person. That's for sure me. I like to be able to write notes and I literally have a pad of paper and a pen right next to me right now because that's just how my brain functions best. So we have that available for you right here if you want to snag that. So you have all the right questions to ask at these venue walkthroughs, and we will leave that in the description box down below if I haven't convinced you yet of its power and its necessity to have this. If you've been around here for a hot minute, yes, this is going to be very closely akin to a video I did a couple years ago, 4 years ago to be exact, where I sang in the car, regrettably, and admitted that I have a coffee problem. We're just giving it a little revampski because content that's older than 2 years tends to get kind of lost in the heyday and whatnot. So we're giving a little spruce up. We're in the same shirt, shorter haircut, and much less singing this time. Probably. I don't know. I make no promises. I could bust out into song randomly. Greatest Showman is still a fantastic movie, and I will die on that hill. Okay, so without further ado, let's just jump right on into 20 venue questions you should be asking. They're going to be divided into 3 different categories. Category number 1 is going to be contract questions. These you can ask out loud, or you can probably glean enough information from your package and or contract to be able to answer these questions. The second one is going to be logistics. Again, you can answer this with your eyeballs as you are walking around the venue, or you can be intentional about verbalizing these if you're not seeing the answer, or you can be asking these questions as you go along. And then the last category is going to be vendors and rentals, because there are stipulations that come along with each and every single venue that revolve around those items and details. First category, contract questions. Question number 1, how many hours are included in this rental? In most of the events that we work, we see about a 6-hour event window from the start of the event to the finish of the event. Sometimes these are changed around a little bit or lengthened depending on culture, depending on experience, depending on the church that the couple wants to get married in, such as like the Catholic Church or Greek Orthodox Church or one of the more traditional avenues for something like that. Oftentimes their services can be a lot earlier in the day, so this is not a black and white rule. But a lot of times we see about a 6-ish hour window if you want to hold it all in the same location. Now that's not the entire time that you're going to need from your venue space. Your vendors will need time for setup and for teardown. We typically see a 2-hour setup and a 1-hour teardown. We are used to operating on a 9-hour rental period. Very common for us. Anything smaller than that, you're going to want to make sure that you're communicating that to your vendors. Anything larger than that, we consider to be a bonus. So most florists, most rental companies, most miscellaneous vendors should not need longer than that 2-hour setup and that 1-hour teardown, because that is considered the norm. Question number 2, will there be a staff member on site throughout the entirety of our rental? This could be a venue manager, this could be an event coordinator, this could be a site manager, this could be they call it day of coordinator sometimes, which I feel like is a really, really naughty misnomer. I don't even know why I call it naughty. That makes me uncomfortable. This is an unfair misnomer. There's a whole video about it here on this channel of day of coordinator versus venue coordinator. They are 2 different roles, so sometimes the language here can get a little bit confusing. I highly recommend going to check out that video if your venue tells you that they have a day of coordinator for you, because you're going to have some questions that you need to be asking. Why do we care if there is a venue staff person on site? If anything goes wrong, does someone know where the breaker box is? If someone has questions about the facilities, about the toilets, about a water issue, about a lighting issue, is there someone on site that knows this location better than yourself, potentially a day of coordinator if you've brought them in on your own, or a family member or a friend. We have literally had an experience before where we didn't have access to a venue coordinator or someone to help us out and couldn't figure out how to turn on the lights for the outdoor reception and the sunset. So it just was a mad dash where, by the grace of God, my husband happened to be there and he literally followed a cord on the ground for like 10 minutes to figure out the source of this, to figure out how to turn this on. So knowing if someone's there is kind of important to make sure you've got lighting functioning, water functioning, electricity functioning, etc. Question number 3, rehearsal. Can we have it at the location? If so, can we have it the night before our event? Sometimes venues, understandably, will book multiple events for a weekend because, there's only so many weekends in the year. So if you have a Saturday wedding, you're going to want to make sure specifically that you ask this question because, yes, you might be able to have your rehearsal there, but can you have it there the night before? They might say, hey, we rent out on Friday nights. We can't guarantee you access the night before. So that could mean a Saturday morning rehearsal, which could mean that you're seeing your fiance the day of your wedding. If that's an issue for you, you might want to keep that in mind. Or you'll have to do it earlier in the week. There isn't a wrong way of doing this necessarily. It's just going to feel kind of funky when the expectation is that you will be able to have it there the night before. So ask if you can have a rehearsal on site. Some venues actually don't allow it, which gets a little confusing because the natural assumption is that you can have it there the night before, and some venues actually don't even allow for rehearsals to happen there in general. They're very few and far between, and it always catches me by surprise when a venue says no rehearsals. I'm like, okay, that's weird for everybody, but all right. That was a very lengthy explanation. Part 2 to this question is, can you have your rehearsal dinner there? Do not assume that you can have your rehearsal dinner immediately following your rehearsal at your venue. We've had a couple people make this assumption and then get into this like kind of uncomfortable, sticky situation because our staff in our company, we don't typically run a rehearsal dinner. We'll run the rehearsal for you, which is helpful if you are on that for a day of coordinator or a planner, knowing the difference between just running the rehearsal and the rehearsal dinner as well. They're 2 separate events for us as event planners. So do not assume that you can host the meal there afterwards. You will need to ask this question specifically. Question number 4, are there any sort of noise ordinances? Is there some sort of limit to amplified music that can be played outside at a certain point in time? It is extremely common, at least here in the States, because I've now worked in multiple states here that have an outdoor noise limit of where amplified sound has to go off at 10 p.m. Typically, this is because the venue that you are operating out of, getting married at, is near residential homes. So you're going to have to turn off the music at a certain point because if it's midnight and you're still bumping music outside and someone's trying to put a baby to bed, like it's a little dramatic and a little complicated for the venue. So they have these noise ordinances put into place. So you can't do that. If you were looking to party hardy later into the evening, make sure that you're looking for a reception space that is indoors so you can continue the amplified music for as long as your heart desires or as long as your venue allows it. In fact, we worked at one in Central California that their amplified music had to be turned off by like 7:30 and the event had to be over by 8 p.m. It was wild. I finished that night and I was like, I feel like I'm forgetting something because I'm just like leaving at 8 o'clock. It was discomforting. But make sure you're asking these questions because every once in a while, you could be surprised by the response. Question number 5, liability insurance. Do you require that we have it? Do you require that our vendors have it? In what numerical amount do you require it be had in? Liability insurance is extremely, extremely common. Some locations will even require that you have a host liquor liability insurance license, which basically means that you are assuming the responsibility as the host supplying the liquor. Some places have you get a licensed bartending company that already has that licensing. Oftentimes you'll see liability insurance in the amount of $1 million. That sounds really scary. I promise you it's not. My personal favorite to work with is eventhelper.com. I'm going to go ahead and link them in the description box down below. It's something like 80 cents to $1 per guest. So if you have 150 people coming, you're going to probably be spending $150 or less on your liability insurance for your whole event. A secondary question to that is, do you require that our vendors have it? Is that a requirement for them to operate on site? This is oftentimes reserved for the vendors that will be there for the entirety of the event. DJ, photographer, coordinator, videographer. More often than not, like a florist won't need to have liability insurance if they're only there for a shorter portion of time, or a baker who's just doing a drop-off. They don't really require that as much. So that could be called liability insurance or certificate of insurance, also called a COI for those in the biz. We like to shorten things as one does because certificate of insurance is a lot to type. Question number 6, do you require security to be present if alcohol is being served? The more I work, the less frequency I see of this. In the beginning, I worked at a lot of locations that required security, and now not so much. Not as many are like, you have to have this security person be present. It does happen. It's good to be aware of it. When it is required, it often comes out of your pocket and is not included in the venue expense specifically. But I haven't seen it be above 2 people at $35 per person per hour. So it ends up realistically only being a couple extra $100 for the entirety of your event. Of course, every dollar counts, especially when you're balling on a budget and you're trying to plan this effectively. I get it. I'm not trying to negate that at all. But it's not that much in the grand scheme of things. Section number 2, logistics. Question number 7 is parking. This is the section that you could probably answer with your eyeballs and your brain space if you have it, or, it's always still good to ask questions or if things are up in the air. The comments on the last video of the amount of people that were like, this was so helpful. Everyone was like, wow, you really know what you're doing because I asked these questions. It just makes you feel a little bit like a boss to go in there and be like, I know exactly what I'm supposed to be looking for. And then you feel more confident making these decisions. And then you don't feel as swindled if you missed something going through the walkthrough. You know what I'm saying? So parking/loading zone. If you are obviously in a big city, parking could be a little bit further away. Loading could be an issue. You've got vendors who have a lot of heavy equipment. That's could be rental company, catering, DJ, florist, where they will need to physically remove items from their vehicles and put it at your event. As a planner, I've had to park as far as a mile away from an event before in a more populated city, in a more populated area. It's an extra complicated detail for vendors. We're not unused to it. We can definitely do it. We can absolutely pull it off. But this is a really great thing to communicate to your vendors ahead of time. Hey, FYI, there's no parking for you on site. You're going to have to park here, but you can drop your stuff off here before the event starts, go park, and then make your way back over. Very few, there's a kind of a caveat follow-up is how long can you leave your vehicle here unattended while you're unloading. Some places are like, you have 5 minutes to get all your stuff out and leave. And other places are like, just throw your hazards on. You can use 45 minutes. I don't care. You will gauge that as you're going through this walkthrough or as you're asking these questions. But it's still important to know if you have to communicate to your vendors that they need to be unloaded in less than 10 minutes and get their car on out of there. Otherwise, they're going to be towed. Just minor details. Cool to ask. Now, the parking end of things, again, will be pretty obvious with your eyeballs in most scenarios. Sometimes you'll be like, is that parking lot, does that count? There's a paid lot. Where do people typically park? Is it enough to host the amount of vehicles that we will need for our event? And I said this in the previous video and it still holds true. You'll need 1 parking spot for every 2 guests. Because yes, you'll have people that are probably coming in 5 packs. 5 people per vehicle. But then you'll also have situations where a single person is driving a vehicle by themselves as well. So it kind of all balances out. So if you have 150 guests, you need to have at least 75 parking spots. Here's one thing I did not clarify in that video. You'll need 75 parking spots for your guests. But if you have a photographer and an assistant photographer, videographer, assistant videographer, a catering team, a coordinator, an assistant, you can see how these vehicles might also add up. So make sure there's ample parking, both for your guest count and for your vendors. If it's a little bit further away, make sure you communicate that very clearly to both your vendors and your guests as well. Oh, and also, is it free parking? Because if it's not free parking, you're going to want to find that out, because some vendors may ask for reimbursement from you because they don't want to be going out of pocket for your event for an expense like that. Or you'll need to communicate that to your guests if they will have to pay for parking. In some situations, you can choose to pay ahead of time for that lot and kind of reserve it for your event, or just take it as you see fit for your budget and for the logistics that you've already got going on. Question number 8, what does disability access look like? This is obviously something that you will know. You've got to figure out based on who you have attending your event. This does go quite well hand in hand with some of the vendors though, as those who have pretty heavy load-ins will have equipment that is likely on wheels. We're used to this. We don't want to carry things for an extended period of time. So most of the heavy stuff that we have is going to be on some sort of cart, rolly bag type situation. But if you have someone who is in a wheelchair or may not do stairs as well, you're going to want to pay attention to entrances and exits. A second floor event space without an elevator is probably not going to be a great plan if you will lose out on having some of your guests be fully able to participate in everything if they can't make it to that section of the venue. This also goes for the material that people will be walking on. There's a difference between really pressed down compacted dirt and uneven broken asphalt or concrete versus gravel. A lot of things to keep in mind as you're walking around a venue. Could you feasibly push wheels over that physical surface? And if you can't, who might that affect? And then lastly, how close are the restrooms? Are they easily accessible by all of your guests? Can they get there conveniently? Someone asked in the comments of the last video, like, how far is too far? 50 feet? 100 feet? I don't know. If you walked it in stilettos after 2 glasses of champagne, would you be affected? Maybe that's a good rule to operate off of. Like, just put yourself in the guest perspective with high heels on. Is that a walk you'd want to make? There is no golden rule when it comes to distance that I can think of. The only rule that you'll want to keep in mind for restrooms specifically, you need 1 restroom for every 30 to 50 guests. If you think, I don't need 1 restroom for every 50 guests, yes, you do. Respectfully, yes, you do. I've been doing this probably a little bit longer than you have. If you have 1 bathroom and 100 guests, you're going to have some problems. Some big, stinky, messy problems. Trust, okay? Trust. At least 2 for 100 people. At least 2, if not more. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Next, question number 9, seasonal issues. Is there a coat check? This was included from the last video. I think I've worked a grand total of 3 events with a coat check, but hey, maybe you live and breathe and exist in a space that has something called weather. I've only ever lived in Southern California and Central Texas, where, aside from the occasional freak polar vortex, we don't know what coats are. So, see if they have one, see if they have something available like that, if that's something necessary for the weather in your area. Do they have any sort of tent option, outdoor option, or rain contingency plan should the weather decide to take a turn? Now, bear in mind, a lot of places don't. A lot of places are like, it is what it is, here's the location. If you want everything to be inside, or if the weather happens to change on a whim, you're going to need to do something called a flip that's inside in the ceremony space, and then it limits the amount of guests you can have in your reception afterwards. It does start to get a little bit complicated if you don't generally have some sort of an idea if it rained, what would happen. Also, venues typically do not have any sort of tent on hand either. Mentioned this last video, definitely want to mention it again. A deposit for a tent is usually very large and very much not refundable, because could you imagine if a bunch of people are like, I'm going to reserve this tent, and then, psych, it's not going to rain, I'm not going to do it anymore. That's a really bad business plan. So they typically require anywhere from a 30 to 50% non-refundable deposit. So it could be like a $2,500 deposit to hold on to that tent for maybe a rainy day weekend. So take your time, ask the right questions. Of course, pay attention to the weather, but don't panic. Just be prepared and plan ahead. Question number 10, are there getting ready spaces on site? And what do they look like? Can we see them? Are there 2 separate getting ready locations? Are there sufficient mirrors and outlets for those that are doing their hair and makeup? How's the lighting in there? Now, most of the time, hair and makeup artists are pretty diligent about bringing their own stuff or setting up near a window because they've seen this movie. Neither you nor they wants it to look like your makeup has been done in the dark, so they're usually pretty diligent about this. But we want to make sure that we're operating on the positive note and double checking these getting ready locations pretty early on. I recently did a walkthrough with a client where they had a getting ready space that the bride and her bridesmaids would get ready in. And it was like literally floor to ceiling, wall to wall windows. And it was very small. And she's planning on having 8 women stand with her on her wedding day. And we both looked at that and went, this is going to get hot in here. Like with the exposed windows, with the sun and where it'll be at. There's no fans. There wasn't really a lot of lights. It wasn't a very well generally thought through location for something like this. So even if they have a space that they call a getting ready room, you're going to want to make sure you take a little peek-a-poo to make sure we've got mirrors, lighting, ventilation, temperature control, outlets, good lighting. You get what I'm saying. If they do have a getting ready location, is it included in the package that you're looking at? They might have one, but it also might be an additional fee to add that onto your rental. Take a look at it, see if it's worth adding on, and see if it has all the amenities that you're looking for from your getting ready space. Question number 11, what does the lighting look like? Most of the time, you're going to be touring this in the middle of the day because it'd be really weird to tour it at night. Most people don't do venue tours at night. But that also means that you can miss out on opportunities to spot potential pitfalls in the lighting in general. Is there overhead lighting? Is there up lighting? What does the space look like at night? Are the pathways lit? Can people get out to the parking lot? We've had park weddings before where it's gorgeous. It's at a national park or some sort of very vibey outdoor location that has zero lighting whatsoever to guide people back to their vehicles after the event's over, which some people are fine with it. All of us have flashlights on our phones. If you have a smartphone, you probably have a flashlight attached to it. However, it's ideal to make sure that there's at least some sort of semblance of lighting in all locations of your event. That includes food preparation and food service. Where you are placing your caterer needs to be well lit enough that people can see the food in front of them. Dessert table, walkways, parking lot, restrooms. Make sure that everything is very well seen, visible, and accessible throughout every hour of your event and doesn't present any sort of, slip or trip hazards. Just in case. Now, cafe lights, like the string lights, the bulbs, chef's kiss, my favorite, absolutely obsessed with them. They do provide a lot of light. It's a surprising amount of light. But Christmas lights are not very bright. So you might see them and be like, oh, look, there's Christmas lights. It's going to be super bright in here. No, the bulbs are like this big. The itty bitty. Cafe lights provide more than you think. That's great. Now, a follow-up question to that is, can the lights be dimmed? This video is so much longer than the last one. The last one was only 10 minutes, and I watched it back and I was like, this is missing so much information. There are very few things more awkward than a well-lit dance floor. I take back everything I said about lights when it comes to dancing specifically. Watch what happens the next time you are at a wedding, especially if you're going to a wedding before your wedding. If the dance floor is well lit, people just they just stay here. It gets dark and then they just actually get into it. So you're going to want to make sure or double check or look into, are the lights in the reception space dimmable at all? Are there hallway lights around it or ambient lighting around it to make sure people can still move around safely and securely? And again, no trip hazards, right? But that no one sees you getting down with your bad self because it's too well lit in there. Question number 12, access to electricity. That's not a question, but you get where I'm going with this. Where are the outlets? How much power can we use? There's something like amperage or wattage or something. My general contractor husband is literally would hate hearing me even say this out loud. I don't know. There's a reason that I'm not an electrical person. You should ask these questions and say, do we need to distribute power effectively? If you've got catering using power and DJ using power and bringing in lights and all of these miscellaneous, maybe a photo booth going in as well, you probably can't put them all on one outlet, right? That's a reasonable expectation to maybe figure that out. But it might mean that you need to work through the logistics and the layout of what your event space looks like to make sure that we're not tripping a breaker. And where is the breaker box? And is there going to be someone there to fix it should anything happen? Oh, there is I knew it. Okay. Restroom location. Okay, this is supposed to be question 13, but we covered most of it. I'm going to go through it just so we're staying in order. How close are they? How many are there? And are they easy to find? You need to have some sort of signage to direct people to where the restrooms are. If as you're walking around, it's not immediately obvious to you where the restrooms are, you might want to consider bringing in signage or asking the venue if they have signs. Question number 14, what is the standard layout you typically see in this space? So many times couples feel this burden of needing to invent their venue, reception, and or ceremony layout from scratch because they haven't received a lot of guidance maybe from the venue. That's not something they typically offer. Some venues do, some venues do not. Some venues will provide the layout for you or help you put it together. Other venues will ask you to do it specifically. There is no golden rule on this one, which gets to be very stressful. So a workaround for this is to say, what does the typical layout look like in this space? What's the typical layout for the ceremony? Where do you see couples turning their chairs? How many chairs usually fit in this space, all pointed that direction? In your reception space, where do you typically see the DJ being placed? Where do you typically see catering being placed? And what you're doing is you're conveniently hacking their brains to figure out what your event potentially could look like. It not only helps you to visualize the general space, which makes it just so much more exciting to do the walkthrough in general, but helps you to figure out where you will be placing these vendors as well should you choose this location. Question 15, how many events do you have on site per day? More often than not, it is one event and that's it, right? Totally fine. But every once in a while, there's those sneak attack venues that have multiple really cool spots or locations that can host 3 or 4 events per day. Immediately my concerns become parking and communication of where you're at, because if you don't have a welcome sign or if you're not giving very clear direction to your guests and to your vendors, it can get real confusing. There are a couple spots that we've worked where they have had multiple events happening on one day, and the DJ will get confused, the florist will get confused, guests will get confused. So what we'll need to do in situations like that is just provide really, really painfully clear communication of here's where our venue is. Don't screw it up. Okay, thank you. I mean, like, different language, but you get the vibe. Another issue that comes along with maybe having more than one event happening at that location on one given day is if you have some sort of venue coordinator, venue manager, someone that is assigned to you in your event, they may not be super easy to find. So we want to make sure that we're asking this question ahead of time. That has happened twice out of all the events that we've worked, where it's been one venue manager for multiple events. One time it went fine, the other time not so much. So we just want to make sure we're all on the same page before we sign the dotted line. Question number 16. What does teardown look like? Who does what? You, as a venue, what do you tear down? Do you offer any teardown services? Do you have tables and chairs that you set up and then take back down? Do you pick up trash? Do you expect someone else to bust the tables? Does trash need to be removed from the premises at the end of the event? I will never forget the first event I worked where the venue said, and the trash needs to be taken off site. And I went, what? Like, some venues have the expectation that you do not leave any trash there at all whatsoever. You need to remove it with you. I wouldn't say this is the most frequent thing we've ever seen, but it's common enough that you need to ask this question. Some venues require that all trash cans be emptied and taken out to a dumpster. Who's doing that? Who is being assigned this role? Now is a very important time to definitely not make assumptions and ask questions. This is where things go a little bit haywire on a wedding day because these haven't been thought through ahead of time. So that's why we make the super long video and the super long list. And then lastly, can we leave anything to be picked up the next day, or does it all have to be removed that night? And make sure that that rule is communicated to whoever's doing teardown on your behalf. The amount of times I've had families say, can we just leave this here and pick it up tomorrow? And I'm like, no. And they're like, well, why can't we? We spent a lot of money, blah, blah, blah. We've had not a bajillion, but a handful of them where family members or friends really want to leave stuff till the next day and don't understand the rules and regulations of the venue. So make sure you're communicating that effectively to those doing your teardown on your behalf as well. All right, last section is vendors and rentals. Question number 17. What are the rules surrounding catering? Now, some locations are very particular about this and others are very loosey-goosey, okay? So this is why it's really important to ask these questions as a part of the download guide that you guys have if you want to jump on down there and get it. We will walk you through the 4 different kinds of venues, the pros and cons of each of them, and the potential pitfalls from each selection to make sure you're a lot more educated before you make a decision on this. And that's included in the 20-question download. So you've got that as security moving forward so you know kind of where we're at with this. But it can be pretty obvious pretty early on if catering comes with a venue or if they have a required caterer or if you can bring in your own. There's a couple different variations to what this looks like. So be sure to read through that in the guide when you download it to make sure you're making the best selection for you and for your wedding day. Now, if it's more open-ended, is cooking allowed on site? Is there some sort of prep area? And do they have any sort of fridge access? Again, assumptions can be rife during this time. So we want to make sure that we're like, nope, we're asking all the right questions. I see a fridge. Can my caterer have access to it? Is there a place that they can get set up? Some locations don't allow cooking on site at all, which sounds a little wild, but when it comes to fire and like fire hazards, I understand a venue wanting to protect themselves. Ask the right questions. Now, alcohol restrictions. Question number 18. Do you have any alcohol restrictions? There we go. That's phrasing it as a question. Good job, Jamie. We already talked a little bit about liquor liability insurance. My preference is always to make sure that the vendor, the alcohol provider, has host liquor liability insurance. I prefer to not mess with that, not dabble in that. It just gets extra complicated when alcohol is involved, in my personal opinion. Still feasible to host it on your own, but make sure you're reading through all of the terms and rules and regulations when you are getting that insurance specifically. Now, what do alcohol restrictions look like? Some locations are beer and wine only. Like, that's it. That's all you get. Some locations say no kegs, no champagne, no hard alcohol. Some locations say you can have whatever you want as long as you book it through this bartending company. And you're like, fantastic, great. And then a sneaky little fee that you're going to want to look out for here. I shouldn't say sneaky because it's not like they're doing it duplicitously. You're going to want to see or ask if they have any sort of corkage fees. Some venues will actually charge you for every single bottle of wine that is opened. The amount varies. The rules vary around it. Ask this question ahead of time so you won't be surprised by a corkage fee on your invoice later should that arise. Question number 19. What are decor restrictions? Are you allowed to hang anything? A lot of places say you cannot permanently affix anything to any surface. So that could be you can't tape it, you can't nail it, you can't screw it into the wall, nothing that leaves any sort of gummy residue behind, even if it's scotch tape and you're like, it won't leave a mark, it could rip some paint off. Right? So what are the decor restrictions? Can we hang anything? If you run into an issue where you want to hang something up, but they have some limitations, think stuff like rubber bands, twine, and zip ties, something that's easily removed, which makes teardown so much more simple and leaves no residue behind afterwards. The only complication with that is you'll need something to affix it to, like a tree branch or a light post or something along those lines that's not a wall. And then are there any sort of restrictions around using a ladder? Some venues are like, no, we don't care. Other venues are like, yeah, you can't be on a ladder unless you have some sort of liability insurance. This one's just wacky, and I feel like it comes out of left field if there's ever a weird ladder rule. So just to be aware of it and have it be a part of the conversation is never a bad idea. But do not assume that you have access to a scissor lift. Okay? That's a machine that literally like raises up, like scissors, to get you up in the, you may, if you see one, that doesn't mean you can use it, okay? It's like a heavy, very expensive piece of machinery. Are there any restrictions surrounding rose petals? You may not know this, but dark colored rose petals will actually potentially stain concrete. So some places are like, hard pass, no go, you can't use red petals or burgundy petals or anything other than white. And then other locations will say, you can't throw anything at all. No confetti, no petals, no nothing. Why? Because they've cleaned it up a few times and it's really flippin' annoying to pick up little individual pieces of confetti from a hedge bush, okay? This then moves over into all sorts of general grand exit or end of ceremony accoutrement that could be tossed or burned or blown, like bubbles. Some places, okay with bubbles. Other places say it's a slip hazard. Ask these questions. Sparklers, probably a no-go in most places in California because it's a fire hazard. Also a no-go maybe inside of a building. And then other places are like, nah, it's cool. We walk on the wild side. But you won't know until you ask. And then last but most certainly not least, what rentals come with this space? What amenities do you include? Tables, chairs, linens, anything that come with this particular location that could potentially, in your mind, you go, that could potentially save us in these other categories so we can stay on budget and still kind of get whatever we want out of this. I'm going to step aside for a caveat real quick. A lot of people will assume that because tables and chairs are included, that it will automatically be more feasible to go with the venue that has them included than to go with the venue that doesn't have them included. If they're already at your venue, then you're kind of locked into whatever chair and whatever table options they have. Rentals in general, the plain basic ones, aren't that expensive. So don't necessarily use that as 100% the selling point for selecting a venue just because they say they have tables and chairs involved. That's a very easy add-on to do with whatever location you pick. And you could potentially get it for cheaper, but you won't know unless you ask the right questions. If they have chairs, can you see them? Can you sit in them? Are they squeaky? Do you like the color? Are they comfortable? If they offer tables, what sizes do they have? How many people can be seated at each tabletop? Are there linens included? AV equipment, china, flatware, glassware, anything with the word ware at the end of it. You get where I'm going with this. Tell us what's included. Are there additional fees with those items, or is that included in the baseline cost? And then, do you offer any sort of speakers or AV equipment? This part sounds great, and I didn't really do a good job clarifying this in the last video. It sounds great, right? But that means that your DJ and or music vendor needs to learn their AV equipment that may or may not be dependable, and they may or may not use it. So it could be a great thing that they have it, or it could be a really annoying thing that they have it. Knowing that it's an option, you can then deliver that information to the person running the sound tech for your wedding day. Could be helpful. It also might not change anything because DJs have seen some things and they may not trust venue speakers. But at least you know they got it, just in case. And then lastly, if you thought this was helpful, you need to join the master plan because this is literally just a fraction of what we cover in there. You deserve to feel empowered and educated when you're making all of these wedding planning decisions. It can feel very expensive and very stressful, but it doesn't have to be. I promise you there is a better way. Join us over in the master plan, link down below. That's what we have for this week's video, guys. Thank you so much for stopping by. I know this is a lot to process, but usually if we can go through this lesson once and then you have the download to refer to really jog your memory when you go to ask these questions, then you end up sitting a lot prettier on the other side. So hopefully you found this helpful. Thank you so much for watching. Now tell me, what are you looking for in a venue? What's something that's really standing out to you, or something you feel really particular about or called to? If you've already booked your venue, tell me all about it in the comments below. I would love to hear from you guys. If you like the video, jump on down there, hit that like button, and subscribe to this channel for more tips and tricks for the modern day bride. And until next week, bye guys!